afternoon. For those who don't know, I'm Stephanie, and I have the joy of helping lead the church across Bicester and Banbury. As Mark said, we're in our series looking at our culture, that is, as a church, how we behave, who we are, what defines us. So there are a whole heap of things that underpin who we are as a church. That is our theology, our practices, different things like that, that you can learn more about in our DNA course if you're interested. Our culture is not those things. It's not about the roots and the kind of hard stuff of our theology. This is about the vibe, right? It's the flavor of who we are as a people, what people see when they come in and join us. And it's worth noting as well that our cultures aren't just random things. We didn't just read a book about culture and go, we'll have A, B, and Z, right? These are things that we've already identified are part of us as a church. They're already key features in our community, but we are just trying to draw them out. And by putting words to them and putting language around it, we're stating that these things aren't by accident. It's not just that we happen to be friendly people, but these are things that we think matter, and that helps us as we then tell new people who are joining us about our church and who we are. And so today we're talking about look for good, and I will confess up front, this does not come naturally to me, right? I'm not the natural optimist. I know there are several of you in the room. Even yesterday, my husband, Chris, said to me, can you just try being a little less defeatist, right? This is my default is to focus on everything that's not working and everything that's not going right, and then to try and fix it, but my instinct is to dwell on those things. And so I'm not saying, let's look for good, because that's something that comes really naturally to me. But because, as the Lord has done a patient work in me, I am convinced that that will change our lives and it will transform our community. And so we're going to look today at the story of Peter, or Simon, as he is when we join him. Simon is a fisherman. He's out with his brother on his boat. So they're in first century Galilee. They're fishermen. They're probably smelly, to be honest. Just living his fisherman life. And then one day, Jesus comes along and says, hey, follow me. Nice simple request. And Simon does. And we can go, wow, what a great sign of faith. I don't think it was in this moment faith. I think this is a picture of what Simon was like, in that he seems to be a kind of just jump in and see what happens kind of guy, right? He's impulsive, he's quick to speak, he's unreliable. I read some commentator this week say that Simon had a foot-shaped mouth, right? He was always getting himself into tricky situations. We see as we read later in his story, he's the only disciple we ever see directly challenge Jesus. At one point, much later in the story, in his anger, he just leaps up and cuts a guy's ear off. And then Jesus has to come along and be like, no, and heal it all. Yet, what we see is Jesus giving him chance after chance. Jesus comes and says, hey, there's something good in you, actually. It's not all bad. There's something in there. And Jesus pulls that out and starts to refine these characteristics that have so often got Simon into trouble. The Lord starts to refine them into the very things that make him the great leader he goes on to become. And so where he is impulsive and quick to jump into things, we later read of him getting out of a boat and walking on the water, which none of the other disciples did. And I think probably it's because his instinct was just to be like, yeah, I'll get out. You know, he's quick to speak and start telling people things. And we see at Pentecost, he's the one that gets up and starts to preach. And it's all because Jesus seen something in him. He's seen something good. He didn't write him off for being impulsive and undependent, unreliable and whatever. He called out goodness in him. And there's this wonderful kind of hinge point in Simon's story. So Simon is often said to mean reed. That is something that is kind of flaky, is the word we'd use for it these days. He's unreliable, he's easily shaken. And I think that is the picture that we see of him. And yet there's this point in Matthew 16, he's just declared to Jesus he believes him to be the Messiah. And Jesus replies, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock," Peter means rock, "on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." You know, names matter. What we call each other matters. Particularly, we see that in the Bible. What we call each other is a statement of what we believe to be true about each other. And so, this is no simple thing that Jesus is doing. He's transforming Simon's, his whole identity by saying, no, you're not Simon anymore. You won't be defined by your unreliability and how easily shaken you are. You will be a rock, and on this rock, I will build my church. And can you just imagine what that did for Simon, for Peter, right? He must have known he was getting stuff wrong. I don't think he was kind of blundering around in all these situations thinking that he was just great and getting everything right. But what we see through this point, this key point in his story, is that he is transformed. He goes on, what we read about in Acts is almost unrecognizable from this first man that we meet. He does become a rock. He becomes the spokesperson for the disciples. Like I said, he preaches at Pentecost. He becomes the first person to take the gospel to the Gentiles, which went against everything that he had been brought up to believe. And indeed, as we know, the church was built on him. He was kind of learned to nurture the beginnings of the church. And even after this kind of life-changing, transforming moment, Peter goes on, he journeys with Jesus, he sees miracles, he's got a strong faith, and is adamant in the midst of that he will never deny Jesus. And that seems to be true from what we can tell. Yet, we see that in Jesus' darkest moments, when everything is crumbling around them, Simon says, "I don't know him. I've never met that man." Several times, someone comes to him and says, "Surely you're one of them. Your accent gives it away." Then he began to call down curses. What a dramatic response. He began to call down curses and swore to them, "I do not know the man." And immediately a rooster crowed. And Peter remembered what Jesus had spoken, that before the rooster crowed, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. Despite this transforming moment, a change in his identity, Simon once again finds himself in the depths of despair and regret at denying his Messiah and his friend who would shortly go on to die. Right, that would have shattered his worldview. The Messiah who had come to save him, to save everyone, was dead. And so where does that leave him? Yet for those of us that are Christians, we know that Jesus' death is not bad news. In Jesus' death on the cross, he went on, he took all our sin and our shame, that is mine, yours, Simon's, Peter's, everyone's. He took it and he defeated death. And he rose again, winning the victory over sin, over shame, over flakiness and poor identity. He reigns over all. And when he comes back, he doesn't do what I would do. Might be a shock. I don't always react in the same way that Jesus did. But for me, having called Peter out time and time again on who he was, changed his name, right? That's not a small thing. And then for him to have still gone on, denied Jesus, been given 2 further opportunities to do it, and continued to deny him, I think I'd have been tempted to be like, do you know what? Fine, Simon, away you go. And yet, that's not what Jesus does. After Jesus is resurrected, he returns to Simon Peter and once again says, hey, there's goodness in you. There's something in there. You were called to be a rock. Come on, bring that up again. And once again, he says, follow me. And Peter does. And he goes on to do all these wonderful things. Because Jesus took the chance to call it out again. It can be so tempting as we are looking for good and we're calling it out in each other to do it once and be like, hey, I've told that person. I've told them that they're great. I've told them that God's made them this. And then when we see them stumble, to be like, must have been wrong. That's a shame. Yet that's not what Jesus does. He continues time and time again to call it out. Because you know what the world gets in? There's plenty of other voices in our lives saying, nah, that's not really who God made you. Actually, you should be defined by that thing. Oh, remember your shame over here. It's just what the enemy loves to do. And yet the example of Jesus would say, let's look for the goodness. Let's call it out and let's do it again and again and again. And I don't know if you've ever had that happen to you, right? I have countless stories of things that I didn't even notice were part of me until somebody else called them out. The key one that comes to mind is that I am naturally quite critical. That doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing. It means that I am quick to notice problems. I'm quick to notice patterns. I'm also really good at assessing risk and seeing where things will go wrong. And when I first became a Christian, what happened was the hyper-optimists around me said, oh, don't do that. Don't be critical. Don't say those things. Don't highlight the problems. Actually, we need to be positive. And I was like, oh, right, my whole life is changing because I've just encountered Jesus. I was like, okay, I need to stop doing all those things and be more positive. And so what happened is I started trying to squash that in me. And it's not something I can turn off because it's just kind of who I am. It's how I experience the world. But I tried to squash it and pretend I didn't notice all the problems and all the way things were going to go wrong. And because I'm very critical, I'm also very self-critical, which means I could see all the ways that I was not doing that successfully, which in turn just made me more critical and more stressed. And one day, somebody, not in a dramatic way, not in I was praying and the Lord clearly said, just in a passing conversation in a queue for dinner, somebody said, oh, that's a cool gift. And I was like, what? Because I'd never thought about it like that. And so actually suddenly what happened is instead of trying to squash something that God had put in me and hide it, I started to pray about it. And I started to refine it so it was used in the right context and it was communicated the right way. And it has gone on to become one of the key skills that I offer the church and my job and many other situations in life. In fact, I've managed to make a job out of it. As a project manager, it's my job to look at the plan that is given to me and say, hey, there's risks here, here, and here. That timing will never work. Or we need to make sure we've done these things within 3 months. I can see where issues might pop up. I can see where the way we communicate might raise issues in other people. And all that happened was really simple, which is somebody looked for the good in me and they took 10 seconds to name it. And it didn't just improve my self-esteem, but it actually transformed my life. It helped me to embrace who God had made me to be and to stop trying to be everybody else. And I have story after story with times where that's happened. And so this is what looking for good is all about, right? It's not just encouraging, but it's about calling out who God has made us. And there are a few things that get in the way of us doing this. I want to take just a bit of time to talk about some of them. So the first, I think one of the biggest barriers to actually calling out the good in each other and looking for it is that we just don't really know each other. You know, it's quite hard to look for good. Well, it's harder to look for good in a stranger. It can be done, definitely, but it's easier in a friend. And so a really simple way to counteract that, let's be generous with our time and with our homes and with our affirmation. And as we get to know each other better, it will become easier to look for good. It also will become easier to do all the other cultures. You know, the better we know each other, the easier it will be to be united, to step out, to expect encounter, and to dream big. Second barrier to looking for good in each other is we have a tendency to put people in boxes. You know, we either say, oh, they always communicate terribly with me, they'll never change. And if we think that about somebody, we're not likely, or it's certainly much harder to look for the good in them, because we're coming at it with the attitude that we'll never find that there. The opposite of that can also be true. I think sometimes we put people in really good boxes, and we say, hey, they've got it all figured out. Look at them. They're up there preaching, or they're such an amazing parent. They don't need my affirmation. They don't need me to call out who they are and look for goodness in them. And so let's just be really careful that we're looking for good beyond what our expectations of each other are. And then my last two barriers are just two sides of the same coin. Firstly, we're too awkward to tell each other, right? We either go, oh yeah, I see loads of good, but I just don't know how to say it. Or, well, wouldn't it be a bit awkward if we're just having tea and suddenly I say, hey, I see that God has given you an amazing gift of hospitality. It might be, initially, to be honest, it might be a bit awkward, but it is worth us pushing through that, because once we get beyond that, there is goodness for us as a church and as a community. The flip side of that is that we're slow to accept these things. We're slow to accept compliments. For some of you, particularly if you've grown up in England, it kind of goes against everything that we've been trained, right? We default to playing things down. And so when somebody says, wow, Chris, I thought you taught really well this morning, and you say, nah, just a few words I threw together, we've done a few things there. Sorry to pick on you, Chris. But by downplaying that, what you've done is you've undermined the work you put into that, because you almost certainly didn't just throw it together. You probably spent a long time thinking and praying about it. You've undermined the work that God did in you through that, and therefore failed to give him the glory. And actually, you've made it much harder for that other person to compliment you the next time. And so the solution to this is really, really simple, which is when somebody says, hey, Jackie, I'm so encouraged by your faithfulness, just say, thank you, right? And I preached this morning, right? And I came off stage and somebody said, oh, I thought that was great this morning. And I said, oh, I'm not really sure. And immediately had to catch myself and go, no, wait a minute, let's try again. And she was gracious and she said, hey, I thought that was great this morning. I went, thank you so much. right? So this is not, I'm not expecting any of you to be perfect as you leave here today. I've been dwelling on this for several weeks now, and still, that my first reaction was to downplay it. And as I said, our cultures aren't new things, right? As a church, I actually think we're really good at encouraging each other. This isn't a preach to convict you. I think we are good at this. But I think there is a call up for us. There's a call for us to go deeper, to go beyond highlighting the tasks that other people have done and encouraging them, thank you so much, you made an amazing dinner, or thank you for leading that group tonight. And actually to look for the goodness that God has put in who we are, right? Not just in what we do. And to take the time to reflect and to pray and to call those things out. Because, it is great to hear, oh, you look great today. Okay, of course it is. That's lovely. But it's even better to hear, hey, the Lord has made you a pioneer. The Lord has given you a gift of mercy. And wouldn't it be great if every time we gathered, we left with a greater sense of that? If every time we were together as a community, we left understanding more of who God made us and what he called us to do, right? That will change our lives. And at risk of preaching Chris's sermon in a few weeks' time, imagine what we would do, right? If everybody around you was truly for you, and you knew that if you stepped into something, you would have their support, you'd have their encouragement, and if it all fell to bits, that they would help you pick it up, what risks would you start to take? What would you start to step into when you knew deep down, I am a child of God? And I'm not suggesting that in doing this, we start to ignore the bad, right? It's not look for good and ignore everything else, because that's not going to help us either. It matters that we engage with the tricky things of life and of faith, that we lament with each other and we wrestle with those things. So it's not a suggestion that we embrace blind optimism, but actually in the midst of those tricky things, we go, oh, but the Lord was doing something there. Or the Lord has done this thing in you through that. Because out of that, we will see growth and discipleship come. And as we surround ourselves with people who are looking for good, right? Culture, this doesn't work if only I do it. You know what, you might all go away feeling encouraged, but I'm going to be exhausted, right? Culture can't come from one person. It comes from all of us embracing this. And in doing this, it won't only be good for the complimented. It's not just, oh, somebody has said something nice to me, and now I can go away. But actually, as we start to look for good and we look for what God is doing in each other, in our situations, in our ministries, we will find reason after reason to praise him and to give him the glory. And when we're having a bad day and we start to get, I don't know if you have these, but these thoughts that say, oh, I could never do that. I'm not good enough. I'm not like her. I wasn't called to that thing. It can be so easy to end up in a spiral of negativity and of despair. But actually, if we fully embed this in our culture, what happens when we end up in those spirals is the people of God will be primed to say, wait a minute, that's not true. Because I've been looking for good in you. And actually, I can see that God has given you the gift of hospitality. I can see that he has made you to be a mercy giver. I can see that he's growing prophetic gift in you. And imagine what that will do for everybody out there as well, right? It'll be good for us, it'll be good for you, it'll be good for me, but it'll be good for everybody else that starts to brush up the edges of our community. Because out in the world, there's despair everywhere, right? The narratives are almost all negative, and they say, you're not good enough, you can't be that, you're defined by your anxiety. And as people start broken and beaten to rub up against the edges of our community, and we look for the good in them, their soul will be lifted as we affirm who God made them to be. And my prayer is that in turn, they will see the one who made them. You know, everything that I'm trying to say, I mean, it's summarized in the title, right? Look for good. But in Romans 12, there's a lovely little line that just beautifully describes this. It says, love one another with brotherly affection and outdo one another in showing honor. That'd be a pretty good start if we can try to outdo one another in showing honor. And so the best way to move more into this and to get over the awkwardness of it is for us to practice. And so what we're going to do is you are all going to stand up and find someone in the room, and you're going to just start talking, looking for good in them. You know each other. There will be things in your mind already. Even if you think they're really obvious, often our gifts are really obvious to everybody except us. So just go to somebody else and start to speak out, to call out in them the things that you see that God has put in them. And then we're going to stop and we're going to pray. But for now, stand up. Come on. I know, it's Sunday afternoon. You can manage. And then find somebody in the room, whether you know them or not, and start to tell them about the goodness that you see in them. I want you now to stop for a little minute and just listen to the Spirit and see what it is that He is saying. And then it's fine if you skipped ahead. The Lord's got more to say. I want you to start declaring those things over each other. You know, there is power in our words and there is power in the name of Jesus. So as God tells you who He made that person to be, declare it over them.